Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Excellent, excellent. Welcome to our third week of the 16th annual Armchair Traveler Series from Friends of the Library. And we are so excited to have you all here today. And we are going to be covering an exciting topic about the local lumber industry in Edenton and the Albemarle and Turl County as well. Very, very interesting. So we're very excited to share this with you. But I'm up here to let you guys know that the library does a lot of stuff. And some of the stuff that we do, we have a full month of activities coming ahead for October. And some of our newest programming that we're going to be having is a crafting circle with Miss Joy. It's open to all ages, and we'll be doing knitting and all sorts of different sorts of stuff. So if you want to try that out, we got details of that downstairs. Along with if you have any grandkids or kids or nieces and nephews. We also have our new affirmations with Miss Ashton, who is going to be doing a group for mindfulness and self-confidence for younger kids from ages 2 to 10. So if you're interested in that, we got the details of that downstairs, along with our regular book clubs, our Friends Book Club, our PM Book Club, our Young Adult Book Club, and all sorts of fun different stuff. So I won't talk forever on this, because if I was to talk about it, we'd be here for quite some time. But without any further ado, let me hand you over to our friends group. Miss Lucy, come on down.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased again to see a good crowd. This is great. This is our 16th year of doing this Armchair Traveler Series, and we have lots of fun things ahead. We have next week, I'm going to talk to you about the Dorothy, which is a ship that came over here in 1584, 1585, and 1587. It was last seen with the Roanoke colony. So, and then the week after that, we're going to have the chief archaeologist from Site X and Site Y, which is Avoca Salmon Creek, which goes with my theory also. He's going to come and talk to us about the things they're finding in Salmon Creek on Admiral Sound. And then the last week, we had this speaker maybe 2 years ago, and they are doing a project that will be shown on PBS that's about the Outer Banks and the history of the Outer Banks. And we're going to see some footage, so that'll be very exciting. Be sure and remember that we don't have a meeting on Columbus Day, so we're going to skip that Monday, but it's every Monday at 5:30 except for Columbus Day, which I think is the 9th of October. So I encourage you to participate in Friends events. We do lots of things. We're famous for our Harry Potter extravaganza that won a statewide award. We encourage membership, and we have a donation box just in case somebody wants to donate, or you can become a member. We do lots of wonderful things for the community. I saw an analogy about the library, which I really liked. It showed an iceberg, where the iceberg, has got books on top. You see the iceberg. And then underneath, there was about 15 things that libraries do that you don't even quite realize they do unless you get involved in your local library. So it's pretty exciting. I'm going to see if Lee wants to add anything.
No, you're doing a great job.
Okay. Well, Seal couldn't be here tonight. I do want to call out our board members that arranged this. I'm the chair, and Jared is a member of the committee that we were on. Lee, of course, Anna Milne, who's not here, and Beth Gagnon. I did so good. And Seal Davenport's got a family emergency. She was going to introduce Bill tonight, but she's her treasure that she found. So we all put our heads together and came up with this The World at Our Shores theme. So let me talk to you about Bill, our speaker. His family grew up in Washington County. He was raised in Chesapeake, got an education at Virginia Tech in forestry, and moved back to the area. And we're happy to have him here. He is an expert on forestry, worked many, many years at Weyerhaeuser, and he's written 3 books that he did bring, and they're for sale tonight. Terrell Timber, Buffalo City and the Blunt patent. This is all about lumber and the connection of lumber to the railroads, which would certainly be important. Very, very knowledgeable. Bill, I'd love to have you speak. Let's welcome him.
I'd like to thank Seal for inviting me here tonight. I'm sorry she's not here, but she contacted me some months ago to see if I'd be able to speak. And I'd also like to recognize Jared. I wrote this book in Terrell Timber, was it 2021? It was anyway, it was the height of COVID.
Yes,
And
yeah.
Gerald was the librarian in Terrell County, and I needed some information from the Terrell County local history room. And I couldn't get it because the
Bill, could
library
you speak a little louder? It's a little difficult to hear you. I'm so sorry.
Jared was the librarian over in Terrell County during the height of COVID when I was writing this book, Terrell Timber, and I needed some information. And so I couldn't go in the library. The library was pretty much closed. But Jared was willing to do some research for me, and we went back and forth on some emails and got the information that I needed. So Jared, I appreciate the help that you had in writing this book, helping me write this book.
Well, thank you so much.
I worked as a forester for 40 years, and I'd always been interested in local history. And when I retired a few years ago, I decided I would delve into the history of the forest products industry here in northeastern North Carolina, because I'd always heard so much about it, and I wanted to find out fact from fiction. My first book is about Dare County, Buffalo City, and the Blunt patent. My mother's family was Ambrose, and they had a connection to Dare County, and I'd always heard about Buffalo City and the legends around Buffalo City, so that was kind of where I wanted to start at. And when I started at Buffalo City, in Dare County, I found out about Richmond Cedar Works. And then when I started doing research on Richmond Cedar Works, it brought me to Terrell County, because they had a big part to play in Terrell County. And then when I got to Terrell County, I found out about Branning Manufacturing Company. So Terrell Timber is a book. The first is a three-part book. The first part is about early Terrell County. The second part is about the Branning Manufacturing Company, and the third part is about Richmond Cedar Works. Following the Civil War, a lot of this area here in northeastern North Carolina was really, the economy was just in ruins. The men that came back from the war, both Union and Confederate, came back to just a crushed economy. There were no jobs. Most people had to exist as subsistence farmers. A lot of their cattle and livestock had been confiscated during the war. The smokehouses were empty. It was desperate times for a lot of people. And what saved a lot of these folks in this area was the timber boom that came about starting around 1870 into about 1920. It brought an unprecedented demand for lumber and building products that the country had never seen. And what led to this was that after following the Civil War, there was a huge immigration effort here in the United States. Between 1880 and 1920, it was estimated that as many as I'm getting a sign from my wife. What's
Louder.
okay? I usually talk pretty loud. From 1880 to 1920, there was estimated that as many as 20 million immigrants came to this country, legal immigrants. Most of them came from Europe. And at the same time, there was an industrial revolution, so to speak, more of a technology revolution. The steam engine came about, cast iron became available. They needed housing, they needed warehouses, they needed factories, they needed everything. So it just caused this huge demand for forest products. Well, unfortunately for the Northeast, most of their timber had been cut. People have been living there for 250 years, and a lot of the timber in the Northeast was depleted. So the Mid-Atlantic, North Carolina was probably the next best place to go, and so that everybody looked to Carolina to supply timber for this huge growing economy in the Northeast. And it became known as the Gilded Age. It was a time in our country's history where there was such rapid economic growth. People thought that they could get rich with all these different schemes. It was a time of robber barons. It was, as some people would call it, it was a time of unfettered capitalism. And it was just, everybody thought that they could make a buck. And so a lot of speculators and investors streamed into North Carolina to to try and harvest the resource we had here and make a dollar out of it. There were several large companies. Browning Manufacturing was only one of several large companies that were operating here. Dare Lumber Company, John L. Roper Lumber Company, Tunis Lumber, Richmond Cedar Works. All these are big companies that operated in this area, and there's just too many companies for me to go through and talk about tonight. So I'm trying to concentrate on Browning Manufacturing Company because Browning had a connection here to Eatonton, so I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about it from the Eatonton standpoint. And the men that ran these companies, almost all exclusively, were Northerners. There were people that had connections to capital. They could get money, where they could come down and invest in mills and railroads. Most of them came from Pennsylvania, Maryland, or New York. There were some Southern men that made a go of it, but almost all of them were from the North. They refer to themselves as Northern capitalists. That's how they like to call themselves. Who in the group, I know some people here, I know some folks have my book, but who here in the group has ever heard of Browning Manufacturing Company? More than I thought. Good deal. John Wellington Browning was born in Damascus, Pennsylvania in 1847. As a young man, he moved to Camden, New Jersey, which is just across the river from Philadelphia. And he worked there as in a lumber yard and selling retail lumber. And he worked there for several years, and he became active in local politics. He was on the town council. He was kind of a mover and shaker there in Camden. But he realized that the profits to be made during this Gilded Age was not in selling retail lumber, but in manufacturing lumber. So he decided that he was going to give up everything he had in Camden. He was going to move to Carolina, and he was going to start a lumber manufacturing business. And where he chose to go initially, this is Eatonton right here. And where he chose to go was down on the Pamlico River. He partnered with a fellow named Stanton, and they ended up buying a sawmill in 1883 under the name of Stanton and Browning. His brother, Clarence E. Browning, was also involved in the business. They purchased the Fowles sawmill there in Beaufort County on the north shore of the Pamlico River. The area that now is called, back in those days it was called Bayside, today it's called Bayview. And when he bought this sawmill, he had a sawmill and his logging crew was one steam locomotive, 8 trucks, which a truck is a car. They call them log trucks in those days, but it's basically a car that you haul logs on. 5 timber carts, he had 6 oxen and 2 mules. So that's where he started his timber empire with when he came to North Carolina. By 1886, the partnership dissolved. He bought Stanton out. Stanton left, and it was pretty much Browning and his brother from that point on. But he realized early on how important the railroad was to the lumber business. To be able to ship out lumber and not have to handle it 2 or 3 times, load it on barges, offload it on barges. So he figured now that he'd sold the mill that he needed to relocate somewhere where he had access to the railroad. He looked at Belhaven. Belhaven wasn't far from where he was at. The Albemarle and Antigua Railroad had been built in 1887 that connected Mackey's Ferry here all the way down to Belhaven. But he still had a problem. Even though if he located in Belhaven, he still had to cross the Albemarle Sound. This 5-mile gap in the railroad was just a logistics problem. The only way they had at that time of getting rail cars across the Sound was what they called a car float. And you could put 1 rail car on it, or you might put 2 rail cars on the big one. So the tugboat had to pull it across. So everything had to get shuffled back and forth with these floats. And it was just a cumbersome process. So he decided to go to Eatonton because in 1881, the Norfolk and Southern Railroad had extended their line here to Eatonton. and this was now the southern terminus of Norfolk Southern. So he had a connection from here all the way to the entire rail system across the country. So Eden was where it was going to be. This is India Wharf. This is in Eden. Whoop, back up. Blunt Street runs right along here. This is Eden Bay, where we're at in the library is just over here a little bit. But this is just off Blunt Street. And this was the main way to get across the Albemarle Sound. This connected to Mackey's Ferry. And you could either take a passenger ferry across, or you could take a rail ferry. It floated at that time. It wasn't very swift. But this was a huge enterprise here at the southern terminus of the railroad. They improved it somewhat with the John W. Garrett, which was a rail car ferry that was put in service that could haul a few more rail cars than what they could before. This could now haul 24 rail cars, but it was still a bottleneck. It's some improvement. But the Branning chose to go to Eden and bypass a lot of these problems with these ferries on the river. In 1890, he made the acquaintance of James Church. James Church was an investor and a speculator from New York, the state of New York. And he had partnered with another fellow early on that he ended up buying out. And over the course of several years, they had acquired quite a bit of land in Bertie County, and they built a railroad in Bertie County. It's called the Kashai and Roanoke Railroad. And it ran from the banks of the Kashai River north of Bertie County to access some of their timberland. Well, J.W. Branning worked out a deal with Church, and he bought the Kashai and Roanoke Railroad. So with that railroad, there was 30 miles of rail in Bertie County. And with that railroad also came timberland, 50,000 acres. As much as 125 million board feet of standing timber. So he really, when he came to Eden, he really lucked into this deal with buying out James Church. And at the same time, he signs a lumber contract with the Chicago Lumber Company to deliver to them 60 million feet of lumber over 3 years. So this was probably one of the largest timber deals packages ever put together in the South. He acquired a railroad, he acquired timberland, he had a contract to sell his lumber. So it was just a package deal that was just a phenomenal for the time. The Wellington Townsville Railroad, remember it was the Kashai Roanoke. It starts here at Wellington, which in the days before the Kashai was called Jaycock's Landing, and essentially it was a log dump. All the timber that was cut along this rail line would be brought here to the Kashai River, and the railroad would dump the logs into the river into a log pond, and then they would raft them together and take them off. So it was originally Jaycock's Landing. They changed the name to Wellington. They extend the line to Powellsville, which is right on the border between Bertie and Hertford County. So now it's the Wellington and Powellsville Railroad. And you notice there's a little town here in the middle called Branning. And that was the railroad maintenance town that they created to do all the service on the steam locomotives and rail cars they had. They had a machine shop, they had a roundhouse, and they had kept all their general stores there. But before there were railroads, you had two ways of getting logs to the mill, and all of it involved getting them in the water generally. In the very early days, on particularly wetland sites where you didn't have the footing to support livestock, you had to roll logs on poles like this. You had to roll them to either to a stream or to the sound, to a creek, where you could dump them in the water and they could be towed to the mill. If you were on an upland site, you could use livestock. It could be horses, it could be mules, it could be oxen, and they could pull those logs to the point that you could also get them in the water. This was a typical setup of logging in those early days. The narrow gauge railroad that you see here, the engine is all the way in the front. You see the smoke coming up from the engine. These are the log trucks behind the engine. This was really the backbone of the timber industry in the 1880s. This is what really allowed them to push deep into some of these coastal swamps and some of these big, huge tracts of timber that no one had ever been able to access before. And it still required a lot of labor. Still required men that, you see how they had to lay poles up here, and they had horses that would roll the logs up to get them onto the log truck. So it was labor intensive, and it was a slow process, but it was a whole lot better than rolling logs on poles like we saw on the front of the last slide. And so again, they would take these logs. Before I got ahead of myself. They ended up, steam finally came to the woods, and this was a typical steam skidder. And a lot of this stuff was invented by a fellow out of Pinetown named Shepard-Pruden. He was a real inventor and had a foundry there, and he built a lot of specialty logging equipment utilizing steam motors and steam energy and these hoists where you could pick logs up now. Instead of having to roll them on the log trucks with mules or oxen, you now had a steam hoist where you could grab these logs, you could pick them up, you could drop them on that narrow gauge railroad, and you could get them to the mill. So the process is, you see the train here. Train comes along with the log trucks behind the train. They roll those logs off the cars into the water. They just dump them in the river. Then you have a group of men that take the logs, get them organized, and they drive log dogs in the center of the log. The wedge goes in the log. Then they run a chain through this loop. And once they run that chain through the loop, they can pull it together to have a raft. And once they're rafted together, a steam tugboat will come pick up this raft of logs and they'll take them to the mill. And you can see how these rafts are these long serpentines, sometimes over 500 logs would be in a raft. And they would pull these to the mill. But it was dangerous work, it was labor intensive, and you always had the risk when you were pulling these rafts of logs across the sound. If bad weather came up, there was always the chance that the dogs might pull out of the log, the chain might break, and you could lose a good bit of your raft of logs. So they decided to go to the next best thing was to go to barges. So they started loading logs on the barges. But get there again, this is still being done by hand. These are men that are rolling logs that's coming off the train. They're piled up here and they're rolling down these poles and stacking them up on these barges in order to pull them across the sound. Now, they didn't have to worry about losing logs like they did with rafting, but it was still labor intensive. But Surrey Parker, again, came to the rescue. He started inventing these hoisting machines that were able to lift these logs from these log dumps and able to place them on barges where they could be hauled to the mill. Branning had two tugboats that he operated. One was the J.W. Branning, and no photograph, I think there's no photograph of evidence that I can find on the J.W. Branning. It was built in 1894 in Portsmouth, Virginia. The home port was Norfolk. The home port was Eaton. But I went to Mariners Museum and I could find no photographs of J.W. Branning. But the second tugboat is named the Arm and Hammer. And the reason it's named the Arm and Hammer is because the Church family, James Church, their fortune came from Arm and Hammer baking soda. So to honor James Church, he named the second tugboat the Arm and Hammer. And it was built, this was actually built in 1883 in Brooklyn, New York, but it was renamed in 1893 to Arm and Hammer, and the home port was listed as Eaton. There's no photographs. I could find no photographs of the mill. I found this drawing that appeared in the local newspaper of the Pembroke mill. By this time, Branning he's got his railroad, he's got his logging going on, he's got his timber bought, he's got a contract to sell the timber. So now he's focusing on building his mills here in Eaton. And he builds a mill complex between Filbert's Creek and Pembroke Creek. Does anybody know where Filbert's Creek is? Filbert's Creek is the one that runs between the old Tasty Freeze and Kellogg Supply. Some people call it Mill Creek now. Between that creek and Pembroke Creek is where he built his mill complex. He would have two large sawmills. One would be called Pembroke, the other one is called Albania. He has dry kilns, planing mill, and he has a box factory there. Boxes are really important those days. Barrels are also important. Boxes are, particularly in this part of the world, because they're fish boxes. People use them to put fish in, and they use them to put corn, potatoes, everything in a box. So a lot of it's really low-grade lumber here would go into boxes. He opened a company store here on Broad Street. That was a company store, but also available for the public to use. The interesting thing about his big mill complex there that a lot of people, I didn't know until I started doing research, is that these were considered to be new modern mills. Originally, they started out on steam. Everything was run by steam. There was the shaft that ran through the mill with all the belts and all. But over time, in just a few years, they decided they needed to convert these steam mills to electric mills. Now, they still powered the generators with steam power to turn the generators, but they started running electric lights in the mill so that they could run a night shift instead of just working during the day. And they ended up putting in water pumps so they could have elevated fire suppression system. And what happened was people were fascinated by what they saw when they looked over there at night and they saw these lights coming from the mill. And gradually, Branning, Grover, Dare, a lot of these mills extended the utilities into town. And the first electricity and the first water, piped water that came to Eatonton came from Branning's mill. It's the source of the first utilities. This is an aerial view of what we were just talking about. This is Filbert's Creek. This is Queen Street. This is the marina just before you get to Pembroke Creek. This is Kellogg Supply right here. Pembroke Mill was located about there. Albania, second sawmill. The lumber kilns, which they used for drying lumber. The planing mill was across the creek over at Pembroke Circle. The lumber sheds were here. Box factory. And this was the railroad as it came in. The main line of the railroad came from the north down to India, to the India Wharf that we just saw, and he had a couple of spurs that ran off into the mill for loading lumber. So just about that whole little peninsula there between Filbert and Pembroke Creek was where Branning was located. The combined two sawmills there, they estimated that he was able to saw 100,000 board feet a day, which was a lot of lumber in those days. By 1894, he had created Eatonton's largest industry, and it's estimated that as many as half of the people in the town of Eatonton worked for Branning. He was that big of an employer. His next move was toward Columbia. He started buying timberland in Columbia in 1894. He knew there was a lot of timber in Columbia, and he figured he could capitalize on some of that. He built a sawmill with 7 dry kilns in Columbia in 1899 on the east bank of the Stubborn Road. His estimates are that once this mill was up and running, he was sawing as much as 8 million board feet a year in Columbia. Those mills are. And of If we look at Columbia, just like we looked at Eaton on this Google map, this is Highway 64 when you cross the Scuppernong River. This is the DOT Welcome Center right here on the right-hand side. This is the Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge Office. And this is the stoplight right here coming across the bridge. So the sawmill was located about here. Lumber kilns are just about where the Pocosin Lakes Wildlife Refuge office is. There's lumber sheds, which were sheds they used to store dry lumber, waiting to be shipped out. He had a couple shingle mills here because there was a lot of juniper in Terrell County, and they took advantage of that. They'd saw those into shingles, so he had a couple shingle mills there. He had a company store in town. This was the coal wharf, because a lot of this stuff was powered by coal. And then he had a boathouse there where they could take care of his tugboats as they came into town. And this is where the railroad ran, just about in line with where today's 64 runs. The railroad didn't come to Columbia until 1908. And this was about the path of where it ran.
What did they do in the meantime? It was 10 years. Push them through the water?
Followed through the wharves, on barges, on rafts, all the way from Columbia to Eaton. By 1893, lumbering and logging are still the largest industry in this region. Brandy Manufacturing Company had grown to be the largest forest products industry in North Carolina at the time. He had mills here at Eatonton. He had one mill at Columbia. They hauled it by water to Eatonton. He had a second mill at, this was Wellington. This is where the log dump was. That's where they hauled logs over there. He extended the railroad from Howesville to Ahoskie. And at the time, I think people wondered why he did that. What was his strategy behind extending the railroad? He tied into, the mill up there tied into the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. And Branning did something that hardly anybody at that period of time ever thought about doing. He built a sawmill in 1899 in Ahoskie that was not on the water. Not on the water. The only way you could get logs there was by rail. And he basically reversed the flow of wood. Up to that point in time, everything in Bertie County went to Wellington, dumped in the river, loaded on a barge, was taken to Eaton. Now, all this wood in Bertie County is now going to Ahoskie. And he's sawing it in Ahoskie, he's loaded on the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, and he's done with it. He's eliminated that water transportation. He now has 4 sawmills operating here in the Albemarle area, the largest forest products industry at the time in the state. 1901 was a pivotal year for Brandy Manufacturing. This is his residence here on North Broad Street.
That's Von O'Neill's house.
In early March of 1901, there were no automobiles in Eaton. You got around town, you either walk, you rode a horse, or you took a horse and a buggy. Well, one evening in early March, Brandy had business uptown. He got into his buggy with a horse, and it was a cool, late winter, kind of early spring evening. So he put a blanket over his lap to keep himself warm as he was going to his appointment. And on the way back, it was still colder, so he took a lantern. They usually have a lantern on the buggy. He took the lantern off and put the lantern under the blanket. But it's not what you thought. What you think. The blanket didn't catch on fire. The shade of the lantern pressed against his leg and burned his leg. Now, in 1901, there was no antibiotics. There wasn't even penicillin. And even the slightest infection could really be serious. And that was the case with J.W. Brandy. he ended up coming down with, if I get this right, syphilis, which is an infection of the skin. It spreads throughout your body. The local doctors in Eden did their best to treat him, trying to do what they could, but they weren't able to control it. And they got really serious. And so, to show you how important a man J.W. Branning was, they telegraphed Norfolk to the Norfolk and Southern Railroad. And of course, he did a tremendous amount of business in Norfolk and Southern Railroad. They sent a special train to Edenton that night with a doctor and a nurse. They got off the train, went to Branning's house, they looked at him, saved about an hour. The doctor said, there's nothing I can do. They've done all they can do here in Eden. There's nothing else that we can do. He got back on the train went back to Norfolk. That was in early March. That was March 17th. On the 20th, at age 59, J.W. Branning dies. He'd been mayor here in Edenton for a while. He was a Mason. He was considered to be the largest lumberman in North Carolina. But he was a well thought of man.
What good has he done?
1901.
Did he have sons, daughters?
He had no family, other wife. He was so well thought of. This was what the proclamation that was issued by the mayor at that time. By the death of Mr. J.W. Branning, Eden has sustained an irreparable loss, a loss that will be seriously felt and affect the plans and arrangements of a large percentage of our citizens. He has been an earnest and energetic resident of Eden for 18 years and has ever had the interest of the town at heart and done so much for her welfare. He issued a proclamation that closed businesses on Broad Street from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. to show their respect for Branning and the prosperity that he had brought to the town. Now, the question I have is, when was the last time businesses closed on Broad Street to honor a private citizen? I would say probably not since 1901, but it might be. And an even better, well, that's certainly a nice obituary, but the one that appeared in the Virginia Pilot in Norfolk, I thought was really something. A gentleman of plain and easy manners never failed to make friends of all whom he came in contact. He held in the highest esteem on account of his high worth. I thought that was he decided he wanted to be buried at his family's cemetery in Narrowsburg, New York. They placed his body on a train, and he went to the train passed through Norfolk. The Norfolk Businessmen and Lumbermen's Association met the train at the platform. John L. Roper and some other big lumbermen were there to pay their respects as he came through. But that wasn't the only tragedy. That was a great one. But by the end of the year, by August, John W. Branning's brother, who's been his business partner all these years, Clarence, he died. Clarence had been in charge of the Hoskin Mill and the Wellington and Hamilton Railroad. So he was doing a big chunk of this, the labor here, running this huge complex. So that was kind of a double whammy for him. John Branning's widow, Elizabeth Branning, was now in control of Branning Manufacturing. She was, by some accounts, probably the wealthiest woman in northeastern North Carolina, if not the whole coast. She was sitting on top of this big empire now. She appoints Horton Corwin Jr. as president of the company and of the railroad, the Washington Railroad. He had served as secretary and treasurer of both companies before, so he was experienced.
Bill, can you talk a little louder? I'm so sorry.
Horton Corwin Jr., Elizabeth Branning appointed him as president of the Branning Manufacturing Company and the Wellington and Powellsville Railroad. His father, Horton Corwin Sr., had been associated with J.W. Branning, and Corwin had been associated with it for a number of years as executive position. So he's now the president of both entities, and he lives here in Edenton, but his family's in Philadelphia. His family never moves here. He stays in Edenton. He goes back home. They'll come visit, but his family never physically moves here to Edenton. He was also born in New York in 1854. He was 47 years old. But his timing was really not good because he almost immediately hit on hard times. He stepped in the role, and a lot of things started happening. He had mill fires in Columbia in 1901. We had the financial panic that swept across the country in 1907 that closed a lot of lumber mills and a lot of downsized a lot of the lumber industry here. It had a major impact all the way across the country. And he starts selling to keep Branning Manufacturing going. He starts selling off some of their holdings, principally in Terrell County. He sells some to Richmond Cedar Works. They had some juniper like cedar on it, some land there. They also sell some land to John L. Rucker Lumber Company. So they're divesting themselves of some of their assets in order to try and keep themselves going. The one bright spot about Horton Corwin's service with the company was that in 1908, the train finally arrived in Columbia, which really helped them out because now they had the train, they didn't have to barge everything over to the east. But in 1916, it was a particularly hot, dry spring. And wildfires just erupted all over the eastern part of the state. And particularly hard hit was Terrell County. Terrell County, there was just massive fires that swept across the county. And these were the days where there was no way, there was no aerial support to drop board on fires. There weren't even any bulldozers to plow lines. There was just nothing you could do about it other than just get out of the way. And these fires burned thousands of acres of Branning's timberland in Terrell County. And so it was really a bad situation. And in 1917, the year following these wildfires, Horton Corwin resigns. He's had enough. He's been through a whole lot. He's pretty much finished with it. In 1917, Elizabeth Branning had remarried a fellow by the name of A.T. Baker. He was also from Pennsylvania. When Corwin resigned, she appoints her husband, A.T. Baker, now as president of the Branning Manufacturing Company and the Wellington and Powellsville Railroad. 1918, all the mills are operated intermittently. They only operate when they've got orders for lumber. They build no inventory. They get an order, they'll run a mill, solve what the order is, and then they send people home. But in 1918, the Columbia Mill closes. They don't just close it temporarily. They sell off the mill, they sell off all the logging equipment, all the rail. They're done in Columbia. As a result of probably those massive wildfires they had in 1916, just a couple years before. 1920, there's another national recession, and this was a really tough one. Some people refer to it almost as a depression that would follow in 29, but this was a bad one. It really slowed down the lumber industry. A lot of lumber companies, sawmills went out of business. They just couldn't weather the storm. And the same was true for Branning. They sold their mill here, which is really the jewel in the crown. They sold it to Foreman Blades Lumber Company. And the rumor was that Foreman Blades Lumber Company out of Elizabeth City really bought it because of the timberland holdings that Branning had. They really weren't so much interested in the mills, they were interested in the lands in Berkeley County and what lands he still had in Terrell County that still had timber on it. 1923, Chicago Lumber and Coal Company. Remember, he had a contract with Chicago Lumber. By this time, it's Chicago Lumber and Coal. And over the years, they kept up a business relationship. Toward the end, they started borrowing money and ended up mortgaging a lot of their properties to Chicago Lumber and Coal Company. They worked with them for a number of years, but they couldn't make, basically all they were doing was paying labor for people to work in the mills and just trying to cover that. In 1923, the Chicago Lumber and Coal foreclosed on the Hoskin deal and it was sold to public ownership. 1927, the Wellington and Powellsville Railroad was also sold to public ownership. So they basically now have lost everything. His widow returns with A.T. Baker, her new husband. They returned to Pennsylvania. They leave Eden and go to Pennsylvania. He dies, A.T. Baker dies in 1930 at age 46. And one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that, remember, he took over in 1917. In 1923, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. As the story goes, he was educated at Princeton, and he had played football at Princeton back when he was a young man. I mean, those were the days where all you had was a leather helmet, and he had sustained a lot of head injuries. And the speculation was that this brain tumor, this problem he had with his brain, came as a result of all his head injuries. So he was operated on in 1923 for a brain tumor. And he never recovered. He just never recovered. I don't know what influence his mental capacity might have had on the downfall of the lumber company, but he was certainly not in good health during that period of time. After his death, Elizabeth Baker, returned to Norfolk in 1930. Norfolk, the Brannings had been big name in Norfolk in those days. And so she had a lot of friends in Norfolk and a lot of social acquaintances. So when he passed away, she moved back to Norfolk and lived in Norfolk for a number of years. But she also had poor health. She died in 1937 after what was reported to be a long illness. They had a service for her in Norfolk, and then she was brought here to Eden. Graveside service from St. Anne Catholic Church. And she was interred in Beaverville Cemetery here in Eden. So, to conclude with
A comment on Beaver Hill Cemetery. The Branning Manufacturing Company had originally owned that land and provided it to the town.
Very good, thank you. At one time, Branning was the largest lumber manufacturer in North Carolina. It was the largest industry and employer in Chowan County, Terrell County, Bertie County, and Northampton County. He provided the first utilities here for Eden. He was a director with the North Carolina Pine Association and also with the Norfolk Businessmen and Lumber Dealers Association. And he had served as mayor here in Eden for a number of years. The only remains that I can find of Branning is in Columbia. There's a little side street in Columbia that's called Branning Street. There's no sign of Branning Manufacturing that I know of here in Eden that's left with his name on it or identifies him as a big part of it. If you go to Columbia, there's the stoplight right here. This is 64. If you take a right at the stoplight, you'll see Branning Street.
Any questions? When they were doing the logs and they would put them in the river and then had to go in and chain them up, were there a lot of deaths from men being, caught between the logs?
Well, it could have been, and they didn't wear life jackets or anything. Those guys would fall off the log. If they couldn't swim, they might drown. But, couldn't find any cases where people died making rafts. But it served a purpose in that there was a big problem with southern pine lumber called blue stain. Blue stain was an appearance grade defect that would streak the log with a bluish hue or bluish color. And if you cut a log in the summertime and you let it lay very long, it would become infected with blue stain, and it degraded the log. So when you dumped the log in the water, it kept the blue stain from causing any problems. And so they really like to keep pine logs in water. And once they started not keeping them in water, they ran sprinklers over them. Make these long piles and then run sprinklers over them and sprinkle the logs to keep them wet, to keep them from becoming blue stain. So the water was an important part of the history of southern pine lumber.
At that period of time, was there any interest or concern about replanting once they cleared off land?
Absolutely not.
So then it became agricultural land, farming.
In the 1920s, I started seeing information about people were concerned about the loss of the southern forest because what was happening here was happening all across the South. And there was some concern about it, but up to that point in time, people viewed timber as just an obstacle. It's something that we've got to get out of the way so that we can turn it into either farmland or pasture land. And if you couldn't do that, if it was a deep swamp or it wasn't suitable for anything, it was considered wasteland. And nobody had any concern with it whatsoever at all. The closest I found was in 1905, I found a letter at Richmond Cedar Works, which they were big and logging juniper, Atlantic white cedar. They were in the Great Dismal Swamp, and then moved down toward the Alligator River, which was the last big holding of juniper. In 1905, they wrote the state Department of Agriculture looking for information. They had a tract of land on Dare County that they wanted to try and actually regenerate to Atlantic white cedar. And they were concerned about it because once that was gone, that there was nothing else for them. So they were trying to figure out a way they could perpetuate this resource. And I never found any response from the state. At that time, people just didn't consider reforestation or any kind of sustainable activity to be something that was of great concern.
I suspect that was the beginning of water quality degradation from sediment runoff and
it was just get it out of the way.
And draining wetlands. I mean, that was probably the beginning.
That was the beginning of a lot of wetlands were drained out. Since because at that point in time it was still steam equipment, and there were a lot of the main drainage canals were dug with steam-powered dredges in those days. But that was the very beginning of that work started in between 1912 and 1920.
You mentioned that the branding company had a store in town. Do you know where that was?
I didn't see an address on it. All I saw was that they had opened a store on Broad Street. That's all I could find. Yes, ma'am.
So Elizabeth Branning Baker is buried in Beaver Hill. Is that where Mr. Baker is buried?
No, he's buried in New York, I'm sure.
And Branning is up north
Branning's
as well.
east
So
of
why did
Pennsylvania.
she come?
This was probably the best years of her life was when she lived here in Eden. She was here in Eden. She was in the upper crust of society, even in the upper crust of Norfolk society, because they were so wealthy. And she traveled back and forth between here and Norfolk, and I expect it was the best years of her life. And when her second husband died, she had no children, no family. She probably wanted to come back here and be close to some of these people that she had socialized with. Yes, sir.
Can you illuminate the distinctions between white cedar and juniper?
It's the same.
Same thing.
Atlantic white cedar, I'm going to impress you now. Chamaecyparis thioides.
Okay.
Is that right, Joe? Chamaecyparis thioides and is the scientific name for it. But most people around here call it juniper. And it's different than cypress. It's juniper.
Are there any buildings, anything that commemorates the Branning family
here? Did they contribute to building anything? Amazing.
Where the mill site was is now a subdivision.
Right.
All gone.
The house, I'm sorry.
John?
The original mill office is the cottage on the water side of Albania, which I'm living in at the moment. And it has a large, strong basement, which was the security room, because the workers were all paid in cash. And so the money for paying the workers was kept in this secure basement, which included a metal roof between it and the first floor of the house.
The house that they lived in on North Broad Street, did they build that house or was it already in existence?
They built that house,
Okay, so there's something.
but the original house burned down.
Oh,
dear.
no.
1905 or
So
1906.
that's.
They rebuilt, Elizabeth Brandon built it back, but the original house that John had lived in burned down.
On the same lot.
What was the name of the infection?
There's syphilis.
Say it again?
There's syphilis. It was a bacterial skin infection. And once it got started, it kind of, your skin just turned red as it just kind of grew and grew and grew and grew. And they didn't have any way to control it.
Does that start with ER or AIR?
I think it's ER, it's ER.
It's an ER.
It's all one word then, thank you. So Elizabeth Brandon was not from here.
ERPSITELA. Elizabeth Brandon, she was not from here. She was from Pennsylvania as well. Her maiden name was Hogan.
Thank you.
Where did the the steel for the rails come from? Where was that produced?
It all came up from up north. They bought them from rail companies up there that did nothing but make rails. It was such a boom time, not only for the timber industry but for the railroad industry. They were working around the clock making rail. Baldwin Locomotives was located in Philadelphia. I'm guessing I think about 1910. I read this. They employed 15,000 men at their locomotive manufacturing facility outside of Philadelphia. They ran it 24 hours a day, and they couldn't keep ahead of the orders. That's how many people were ordering steam locomotives.
So he died, tell me again the date that he died.
He died in 1901. His day of death is March.
I was just wondering if there was any
March 20th.
correlation with
March 20th.
the people in town trying to get the cotton mill going for more jobs. I was just wondering if that was correlated, but not really.
March 20th, 1901. And he was referred to in the papers a lot of times as the Prince of Northern Capitals. People had a high regard for him.
The story that I've heard about that is Mr. Philip McMullen's father. It's Mr. Sidney McMullen. He was a cruise tenant for Brandon Mills. And he knew about these people who lived in Alligator. And they lived on these little teeny farms and they weren't making it. So they went, anyway, they got some of the families that came to the cotton mill were from Alligator. And that's how they knew about it, from Mr. Sidney McMullen.
And at the same time, I think there was a lot of people from Buffalo City came over here working.
There's a couple of families.
And McMullen's grandfather was ended up being the superintendent of Columbia Mill. S.M. McMullen was the superintendent there.
And Mr. Sidney McMullen, that was his father.
It was his father. I'm sorry. He was the superintendent there at the Columbia Mill before it closed.
But there's the Alexanders and the Twitties and the Fast Nights. They all came from that.
Yes, sir.
Is there any value to any of the old logs that, and the rivers and?
Well, there's people across the south that have made quite an industry of salvaging sunken logs and resawing them and selling them, particularly cypress. Cypress was notorious for, there was a lot of sinkers with cypress. They tended to be heavy logs, and some cypress would float, but a lot of cypress would sink and you would lose it. Pine, you generally didn't lose too many pine logs, but it's possible that you get waterlogged. There were cases where rafts of logs, if they'd been in the water long enough, would go under, and they couldn't pull it because they were submerged. It was too much against them. Some people, particularly down in Georgia, Okefenokee, where they had a lot of cypress, and they would go through 6 months ahead of time, and they would girdle the trees, they would kill them. Chop all the way around the tree to kill them, so that they would dry out some and lose some of that water, so they didn't have as many sinkers as they had up here when you had a fresh cut cypress. You don't lose all of them, but you could lose a few of them.
I know there's a lot of them in the rivers.
I think there's some of my big streets.
Yeah, I was always
Well,
wondering
I'll tell you this.
working.
You gotta get a permit from the state of North Carolina to pull them up.
Oh, okay.
How about that?
You should.
Thank you.
Thank you
This
so
was
much.
amazing.